you're a guy that has a degree from Harvard, right? So you had to have known how to navigate the game better than almost everyone else in the world. Did you do well in the classroom setting?
I did. Yeah, I did well in the classroom setting. I took to it. I probably fall in that bucket of students that needed that environment, or where it just kind of fit my learning modality, which I think we're all programmed to learn in different ways, in different modes. So the classroom environment always did suit me pretty well. What I would say is I had a resource that a lot of kids have, but not enough kids have, and I also had very supportive parents who were engaged in my education. So it was really a 1-2 punch, right? The classroom environment it gave a lot of resources, obviously a lot of lessons, but then my parents always set the tone. So even kind of our previous discussion a few minutes ago, where we see some kids thriving in this kind of remote learning environment and some kids not thriving, there's a third party there. There's a student, there's a teacher, but the third party are those home educators, and they play a huge role, and they played a huge role for me.
So you were at one point in banking before you got into education. So it seems like, a winding path that you would be running, an education program, whereas before you were at a startup for banks trying to get them more online. How in the world did this transition happen?
It happened pretty naturally. I know those industries seem pretty far apart, but the underlying theme behind those two is that in both what I'm doing currently in education at PSS and what I was doing previously at Encino with banking and financial services, is we were trying to bring tools and technology to the people in the trenches of those industries. So no one would look at me and say, well, you were a financial services wizard. You understood, lending and credit and financial needs. And at the same time, no one would say you're an educational genius. You understand, the tough elements of how to educate a society. I don't claim to be a domain expert in any of those. My domain is technology and change management, which those things, those two things are kind of ubiquitous and really industry agnostic. Although I deeply care about both of those industries.
This has got to be your Christmas then, man, because there is no time when people have been like, we're going digital, and all the people that were lagging behind. So in the ag world, which I spend a lot of time in agriculture, one of the big things that you heard all the time was, hey, I would let you guys move this system to being online where Farmer Joe could just buy online, but he really needs somebody there, and you got to be there and, import the data. He's never going to want to do that. Well, when coronavirus hit and all of a sudden those salespeople couldn't go out, turns out Farmer John did know how to use the internet. He did know how to order things online, and he didn't need that salesman.
Yep. That's when, that line that you said, Farmer John doesn't want to do it. That line has so many cousins, and, the parents of that thinking are really, it's always been done this way. Right. And that's said in every industry. It was said to me a lot in the military. It was said to me a ton in banking, when we were taking banks, community banks, regional banks, and really the largest banks in the U.S., we were taking them online. We were taking customer data into the cloud and encouraging our lenders to put online applications, put mobile loan applications out there. And they said, well, a lot of my population, or we worked with ag lenders. They're actually some of my favorites. But, our lenders just don't want to do it. They're not tech savvy, which, in the ag space, that's got to be one of the most tech savvy industries with what they're doing with harvesting and yields and those sorts of things. So we always just leaned in and said, well, that may be true. Your customer well. I'm not gonna pretend you don't. But I've got a feeling your customer orders things on Amazon, right? The numbers just kind of bear that out. I've got a feeling that your customer keeps in touch with their family, via FaceTime or Zoom or what have you. And we just leaned into it. it's always a slow slog until it's not. All right. I'm this big proponent of the power rule versus kind of the bell curve, where things happen really predictably and you can model them out and they're linear. And actually that doesn't really represent real life. Real life is more dominated by the 80-20 rule, right? The power curve, which is things happen really slowly at first, and then they unfold much faster than you ever thought they could.
Yeah, I'm totally swept up by the idea of a Pareto distribution, that in any given group of people, 20% of the people are doing 80% of the work, or whatever your you're getting 80% of your business through 20% of your clients. It's one of those things that once you see that out in the world, you can't help but see Pareto distributions everywhere. And bell curves, you see those, but only when we're saying, all right, let's pick a median and then make sure that everybody fits on both sides of that curve. Whereas a Pareto distribution, it doesn't matter whether you're playing hockey or you're selling stocks or whatever. There's always going to be a few people that get shots on goal way more than everybody else. And then technology only amplifies that enormously.
That's right. Yeah, that's exactly right. I think about this principle a lot because when it kind of hit me in the head, you see it everywhere, right? That bell curve, that distribution is really forced. It's rather artificial. It describes very few naturally occurring phenomena. And I think about it a lot too, especially someone with young kids, because I think about the ideas that we hold or the ideas that we miss. And those are one of the big, powerful ideas that I want to ensure my kids understand, which is, there's a lot of rules in this life that we didn't make or create or can influence, but just take a hold of this phenomena and observe it unfold, and ultimately, use it for good, and don't try to fight it, because it's this tidal wave that just kind of moves the world.
There was something going on when I was coming up through school where there was a real push away from things like understanding statistics. And so I don't know where you come off on this, but as I've looked into things like IQ, they do actually fall into a Bell distribution, right? You could argue about how valid is the IQ test or what does it actually measure. But if you go give that test over time, you will see half of the people fall below whatever 100 IQ and half of the people go above, and it kind of goes out in a distribution. I had been convinced that was actually not real. And it wasn't until I was in my 30s when people started explaining to me Pareto distributions, normal distributions, that you start being like, wait a second, there are things out there that we can detect and they happen over and over and over and over again. Once somebody's shown you the math, it's plain as day. Why do you think people weren't teaching this for a while?
I think because it's not it is naturally occurring. There's some evidence that points to the fact that, just our brains from an evolution standpoint can't comprehend, it's hard for us to comprehend infinity, right? So it's very hard to comprehend a phenomena is really as violent or seemingly unfair as Pareto's principle. And in some ways, you could argue, man, that's unfair. That's unfair to think that, 20% of the population holds 80% of the wealth. And we can have those debates, and we should, right? But unfairness doesn't equate to it being untrue. And so you're right. The bell curve is useful in things like IQ. It's also useful in things like height and weight. There aren't people that are 20 feet tall, right? There's an average height for a male and there's an average height for a female, and everyone falls within, one or two standard deviations for those things. But what we can't do is then take that observation and that framework and apply it to the rest of real life. What it'll cause, it'll change your behavior and your outlook, and really cause, I think, a lot of pain and anxiety when you observe a world that, oh man, that just doesn't, I understand the bell curve, but this phenomena doesn't fit into it. Why is this happening? I think that's kind of part of the reason, why it isn't taught and really hammered home, because in some ways Pareto's principle is violent. It is unfair. It doesn't feel right or natural, but I think it is.